All right. Good morning. Good morning. This morning we're going to look at John chapter 19, second half. John chapter 19, we've looked at the first half last week, mainly from a metaphorical perspective. We looked at how Jesus was on a tree in a high place. He had just come out of a garden, and how all these things sort of point towards a new creation, a new Garden of Eden with the true Adam there in the garden, acting the way Adam should have acted, and those sorts of things. Now, let me make another metaphorical connection before we get into talking about what happened there with Jesus. If you remember, this in the ancient world, in the first century, Rome was primarily in charge of the Western world, of what we would call it, right? And out in the more remote provinces from Rome, right? Gaul, Greece, Asia Minor, that's modern day Turkey. Gaul is modern day France, if you didn't know. Egypt, they would put up statues or larger than life images of the emperor and his family. And why would they do that? Well, they put these statues up to show the local people who their leaders were, right? And Romans weren't the first ones to do it. They weren't the last ones to do it. I mean, we blew half a mountain apart to put faces of American presidents on there, right? And so they set up images. They set up likenesses. They set up statues for themselves so the local people could look at them and say to themselves, that's the man who rules over us. At least that was their intention, putting up the statues, right? That's the man who we give our allegiance to. That's the man who's brought peace and justice to our world, right? Those are air quotes, right? Because under their breath, they're saying, that's the man that we're paying such high taxes to. That's the man whose army killed all of our fighting men of our nation. That's the man we'd like to get rid of. Right? So the idea of someone putting an image of themselves in the country that they rule is an important clue for us as we understand the very first chapter of the Bible in Genesis. On our Wednesday night class, we've been going through this, right? Talking about the image of God. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and he makes the sky and the dry land and the sea, and then he fills those up, those realms. Then he fills those wild places that are now ordered with plants and fish and birds and animals. And so this is his world, he's saying. He's the one who created there. This is the world over which he now rules. This is the world that he wants to respond to him with love and gratitude. But he looks around and he can't find a creature that can do that. So God places in this new world an image, a statue. The word tselem in Hebrew literally means statue of himself. And so, except, right, because of who God is, he isn't a statue made of stone or wood, right? God is a God of life. He's a living being. And so we're told that the image he puts here is put here for a purpose, so that through his image, God and his life-giving rule can go out into this new world wisely and lovingly. That if they come under the rule of this image, if the world comes under the rule of this image, that's you and me, the creation can properly honor its creator. That image, I've already said, is the human race. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 28. In the image of God, he made them, male and female, he made them. And God gave them instructions, right, to do what? To be fruitful and to multiply. And he took be fruitful and multiply and to look after the garden and the animals. And so within those 6 days there of Genesis chapter 1, The human race then is created on the sixth day, the Friday. And after that, God rests, and the work is complete. And the writers of the Old Testament knew that picture of the human being, that ruling under God's lordship, that revealing and using God's wisdom and stewardship over creation, that's the same picture they had of a perfect king. So sometimes it's hard, like if we turn over to Psalm 8, we looked at that on Wednesday also. Psalm 8, the 8th Psalm. It's hard to tell whether they're talking about a king or whether he's talking about the whole of humanity, the whole human race. Or maybe it's both. Let me read a few things. Yahweh, O Yahweh, how magnificent is your name throughout all the earth. You have covered the earth, you have covered the heavens with your majesty. From the mouths of infants and nursing babes, you have established a stronghold. So the babies are establishing a stronghold by their words, babbling babies, on account of your adversaries, in order to silence the enemy and the avenger. What is a human being that you remember him? The Son of Man that you look after him. You made him a little less than God. You crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. So is that one king or is that all of man? Sometimes it can be difficult for us to tell. And so when we look at the beginning of John's gospel, all the way back in John chapter 1, we see a similar picture. We saw John telling us the story of creation and new creation. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was with God in the beginning, and all things that were created through him. And apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. It's John chapter 1. The one who was with God, the one who was God, who was alongside of the Father, and who was reflecting the Father's character and love, became a human being, became flesh. And it was somehow mind-boggling appropriate that should happen. And so this is kind of like the sixth day of creation, only taken up a notch. Now, at last, with the Roman emperors and creation stories in our head, the Roman images of Roman emperors, and this creation story in our head, we find ourselves here on a Friday morning, on the sixth day of the week, looking at the Roman governor and his strange prisoner that he has, who hasn't done anything wrong. He can't find any guilt in. He lets the soldiers dress him up as a king, sort of, puts a crown of thorns, slaps him in the face, beat the crown into his head. That sort of tells you what they thought of that claim. They knew he wasn't a king. Pilate says the words that will continue to haunt us throughout the rest of this lesson. Look, here's the man. Here's the man. Here is the true image of God. Here is the one who's brought God's wisdom into the world. Here's the embodiment of God. The one who has made the invisible God visible. Neo, stop. You need to pay attention to what we're saying here, okay? Here is the king. Here is the breathing statue, the emperor over all of creation, who's put himself in his own world so that his own world could see who the true master over creation is. And all his subjects can do is to beat and mock and mutilate and slap and scream for his blood. these accusations, they're like the crown of thorns, right? Notice that it's the sharp bits of creation that are drawing blood out of the Creator. And all of this is part of what it means to be God's image. He was planted in a territory that belongs to him, but that's in rebellion to him, right? He was in the world. And so if we pick up with John chapter 19, and we pick up with verse 26, there are two people mentioned here that feature very prominently in John's gospel. And that is Jesus' mother and the disciple that Jesus loved. And that's most likely John. And so this is the last time we're going to see Jesus' mother. But if we think all the way back to chapter 2, right, when the wine had run out, she didn't quite understand what was going on then. Just like she doesn't quite understand what's going on right now, that his time hadn't come. But she knew that the way to get things done was for people to do whatever he said, right? And this is where it was all leading. That was his calling, was to turn the water of human life that he was living into the rich wine of God's love that could be poured out and given to everyone else. That was now happening on the cross with him. And he tells John to take her home to his own home and welcome her as though he's his own mother. But the story of this water and the wine, and I want to get back to the water and the wine later on in the lesson here. The story of the water and the wine has even more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's even more resonance with this scene than just Jesus' comment to Mary. Right? Here's Jesus, thirsty. And they give him this low-grade sour wine that was used for the soldiers. It's all the rage now. They call it kombucha, right? It's wine that's gone sour, and that's now vinegar. So he gives others the best wine. So good is this wine that people tell other people about it. And he himself, in the moment of agony, has the cheap stuff that these lowest ranked soldiers in the army drank while they were on duty, so they couldn't get drunk. And with that, I think there's two other things that sort of open up, two sort of windows that open up that John allows us to see through on this simple and sad story of Jesus. And the first one is Jesus is thirsting, right? First, we're reminded of all the many times that Jesus had spoken of water. We went over this in the class. That there's this sign of chapter 2, right, that we just mentioned. That there's a long discussion about living waters with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. And Jesus offered her that living water. And Jesus was very clear that there was no end to that living water. It was abundant. Then in chapter 6, he talked about those who had believed him and that they would not only never be hungry, but that they would also never be thirsty. And that's ramped up even louder in chapter 7, where he's speaking of the living water that was available to everyone and anyone who came to him and submitted themselves to him. That they could satisfy their thirst forever by believing in him, so much so that they would have rivers of living water springing up out of themselves. That's another image from the minor prophets. Don't have time to get into it today. And so all of this sort of just heightens the sense of horror and agony that we see. And we get the full impact of what John is saying, that the thought of Jesus being thirsty, has the water of life failed? Right? Has the wine run out for good? See, he could save others like they were going to say in the other Gospels. He could save others, but he can't save himself. And I mentioned this during the class, but it's just like with the crown of thorns and that purple robe that was meant to mock him. That John is saying that this is part of the truth of it all. This is how Jesus must do what only he can do. He must come to the place where everyone else is. The place of thirst, the place of shame, the place of death. Because that is also a fulfillment of Scripture. We didn't do it during class, but let's read it now. Psalm 69. Psalm 69, start of verse 19. You know the insults that I endure, my shame and my disgrace. You are aware of all of my adversaries. Insults have broken my heart. I am in despair. I waited for sympathy, but there was none. For comforters, but found no one. Instead, they gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink. That is his glory. The gall and the vinegar is his glory. It is his joy, because what he's going through is going to turn the water of our lives into the beautiful wine of God's love. There's one more thing here John wants to say, that second window I was talking about, that we can look out and look through with a different view on the world. And that's the allusion to chapter 2, right? The changing of the water into wine. John told us that this was the first in a sequence of signs that Jesus revealed his glory through. That's the words of John. The second sign was the healing of the rich man or the nobleman or the ruler's son in Capernaum in chapter 4. From then on, John just kind of forgets to label them or number them. And so we're sort of left to count the signs for ourselves. There are more than 7 miracles here, but there are 6 major miracles that happened during Jesus' life. And I think they go sort of in the sequence. Water to wine in chapter 2, healing the sick boy in chapter 4, paralyzed man in chapter 5, the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of a blind man, the raising of Lazarus. And that brings us to number 6. And I don't think that John intended for that number sequence to stop at 6, because John knows the illusion he's going for. And the illusion that I believe John is going for is from Genesis 1. That Genesis 1 is still in the back of his mind all the way from chapter 1 when he was writing about Genesis 1 in his gospel account here. And so the sequence of 7 signs completes this new creation that Jesus is bringing in himself. And so now here we are at the foot of the cross, that John has told us throughout his gospel that Jesus is going to be lifted up with glory. And this is going to be the moment where God's glory is shining through so clearly, in full strength, that glory is showing through. And the signs are things that reveal God's glory. And so the 7th greatest sign, Jesus intends the crucifixion itself to function as that 7th sign, that he has fully completed his final task. It is completed. And when is he in the grave? On the Sabbath. And that word we talked about during class, but for the benefit of everyone else, that word that's translated "it's done" or "it's finished" is actually a single word in the original language, right? Teleo, it's a word that they would write on the bottom of a bill. Don't think of paper because they didn't have paper. Clay tablet, vellum, something like that. Scrap of pottery. They wrote it. It's finished. The price has been paid for. Jesus' work is complete. And now this finished work, his completed work on that cross, on that work, we can now begin to build our own lives. And so, as we see his completed work there, he's died by verse 30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." Then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. John needed to be at this location here so that he would have an answer for people who before too long, right? Not even 100 years after Jesus has died, would say that he hadn't really died on the cross. Because the story of the resurrection is so huge, it's so mind-blowing, so counter to what we see in nature, that it doesn't fit into our preconceived worldview, right? Of course it doesn't. Nobody has a worldview that allows for somebody to be crucified on Friday, thoroughly dead and buried, and alive again on Sunday. Alive with a life that life itself cannot leave, that death cannot touch the new life that he lives. But John has the best possible answer to the suggestion that Jesus didn't die. He says, "I was there." He's giving us firsthand evidence. And so what did he say? Or what did he see? Sorry. What did he see? To understand that, we need to understand first why the Jews wanted the bodies off the cross. And secondly, we need to understand how the Roman soldiers went about their job. And then third, what happens sort of medically inside a recently dead body. The Judeans wanted, the Jews wanted the bodies off the cross because it was Passover time, but also the next day was not just a Sabbath, but it was a very special Sabbath on their calendar. And the Bible, especially in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 23, there's the citation I forgot, had insisted that bodies of executed people should not be left hanging there overnight. It would pollute the land. So they asked Pilate to take them down. And Pilate, of course, hadn't had the men crucified in order to let them down and live at the last minute. He didn't want half-dead people so that they could somehow be alive again. But if we remember, crucified people often stayed alive or half alive for days. Jesus was unusual in that after his long ordeal of the Roman scourge and those sorts of things, he died with only a few hours. The way that crucifixion killed people was a form of torture. That you were hung by your arms and you wouldn't be able to breathe. So you'd push yourself up with your legs to take a breath. People do this until you run out of strength, until you finally can't hold yourself up. Most of the time you'd suffocate. So the quick and typically brutal way to finish it off was to break their legs. Suffocation would then follow because you couldn't physically push yourself up enough. So that's what they did to the other two people on either side of Jesus. Right? They probably took their spears, broke their legs, screaming in agony, then convulsions, and then silence as they died. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. Right? The soldiers were confused. That was quick, right? Was he maybe faking it, right? And no Roman soldier is going to let him go, because if he actually is alive, the death sentence would fall to the soldier. So he stuck his spear in Jesus' ribs, and it would either kill him or prove that he was already dead. But the test was negative, right? And we know that after death, sometimes fluids will separate out in our blood and the plasma and different things. But medical details have been interpreted in different ways. But the point is that whereas a living body would have produced blood, a dead body from somewhere in the side, in the chest, would produce a mixture of clotted blood and some sort of watery substance. We know now that Jesus really is dead. This writer saw it. He insists to the truth of this evidence. But of course, we're not just told this stuff for the sake of historical detail, right? That's important because the Word really did come and become flesh. He was not a phantom. He was not just a spirit that played dead on the cross, like the Gnostics would claim. John has left us with no doubt all of these details were to be seen as a sign from God about what all these things mean. We only have to think back through John's own words here in his gospel to all the places where water and blood were mentioned to realize that again and again they all point to Jesus as the source of life, as the source of cleansing, of the source of purification. And all those themes come together at this moment, and they point to Jesus as the true Passover lamb. If you'll notice, this picture is actually from Revelation chapter 4 and 5. In this infographic, this is, if you ever follow the Bible Project, it's from one of their posters. And this graphic has many of its themes being put into motion here in John chapter 19. Because in Revelation, John hears what? The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David. That's what he hears. And he turns around and he sees, where's it at, Lord? There's no lion. There's a lamb, though. And he's dead. He's bleeding. But he's alive. So the only one who's worthy to open the scroll, if we mix the metaphors here, is the Lamb, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, who comes in the form of a lamb who is dead but alive, who's been sacrificed but is alive. And at the moment when the lambs are being killed in the temple, Jesus himself is the true Passover lamb, the one who takes away the sin of the world, right? Because the Passover regulations that we read in class from Exodus 12 and Numbers 9, they specified that no bone should be broken. And so at the same time, two themes are being combined. Jesus dies as the true Messiah, bearing the sin and the shame of Israel and of the world. Right? That's the Zechariah one we talked about, that they should look on the one whom they pierced. And that's a passage that's speaking powerfully about this great time of suffering and mourning that's going to come on Jerusalem. That God was going to bring them through that time and bring about redemption and rescue and deliverance. But the immediate result of the piercing and the mourning, according to Zechariah, is that a fountain is going to be opened for the house of David and the people of Jerusalem. A fountain that's going to cleanse them from sin and impurity. That's in Zechariah 13. That's what the water and the blood means here. Jesus' real death brings a real deliverance from sin. That God's kingdom was now being inaugurated through the crucified Messiah who died for his own enemies. His death was a conquest over evil. So let's wrap this up by beginning with chapter 1. If we go back to chapter 1 in John, it says that he was in the world. The Word became flesh, and he was in the world. And let's see what that says, because it says that when a living, loving God comes in person, in the person of his own Son, to live among us, his own creation that's rebelling against him, in the world he made that he still loves, the proper form for him to take on was not a superhero sweeping through the rebel state with a sword and, well, in those days, a horse and a chariot, right? It wasn't going to be a blaze of glory in this fight. The appropriate form for him to take was a kind of living statue that tells the subjects who he is the form that Jesus has now taken. Nailed to a cross. King of the Jews, crowned with thorns, with blood running down his face. This innocent king, this true man, true human, the one who told the truth, who had been accused of blasphemy. Here is the man. Behold the man. Those words hang over all of chapter 19 as Jesus goes to the cross, right? This is John telling us. He's telling us that this is the true reflection of God. This is what it means that Jesus, the eternal Word, took our flesh on so that we could become a part of his family again. Look at this man. Look at this man, and you'll see the living and loving and bruised and bleeding eternal God. The week of new creation is now over, and it's time to rest. So Jesus is taken off the cross and put into a grave, and we'll find that out at the end of the chapter here. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he fears the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission so that he came and took his body away. The week of new creation is over, and it's time for him to rest, this time in a grave. Next week, we'll look at how that grave came to be empty. But this morning, if you are willing to stake your life on Jesus, if you are ready to pledge yourself in loyalty to Jesus, the Messiah, the living Word, the living, emphasis on living Word, next week, we'll see that. If you're ready to put your faith in him, please tell one of us so that we can help you do just that. Because if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the one who came to selflessly conquer over evil and gain the victory over sin and death, then you need to repent and decide that you want to stake your life on his work, not your own work. That's called repentance. And then you need to take that next step that unites you with Christ. You need to put Christ on in baptism, like Paul says in Galatians chapter 3. In Romans chapter 6, though, the imagery of the cross, of his death, his burial, and his resurrection is what Paul uses. Romans chapter 6 and verse 4, and we'll end on this. Therefore, we are buried with him in baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if, conditional statement there, if we have been united with him in the likeness of his death, we will certainly also be joined with him in the likeness of his resurrection. If If you're ready to make that commitment, we can help you with that this morning. Please let us know whether it's the prayers of the congregation that you need or whether it's the waters of baptism that you're ready to stake your claim on Christ and his final work and not your own work. If you're ready to do that this morning, please let us know. Let's all stand and sing the song that's been selected here. Number 1.